The anniversary party was held in the conservatory, as it always was, because my mother insisted on lilies in January, and the conservatory was the only room in that house where lilies could be coaxed into bloom, despite the cold. 43 years of marriage. I had driven 11 hours from Portland with my daughter asleep in the passenger seat, a wrapped envelope resting in the back beside her overnight bag, and I had told myself the whole way that this year would be different. That was the first lie I allowed myself in a very long time. My brother Elliot had arrived 2 days earlier, which I knew because my mother mentioned it 3 times on the phone before I left, each time with a different inflection. Proud the first time, relieved the second, and something I can only describe as apologetic the third. Elliot had not driven 11 hours. Elliot had flown, business class, on a card he did not pay for. And when I walked into that conservatory and saw him standing at the bar with his hand resting on my father's shoulder, like a man who had already inherited something, I understood exactly what the apology in my mother's voice had been about. The room smelled of white wine and the particular brand of expensive cologne Elliot had worn since his second wife introduced him to it. My father stood at the center of it all, pink-faced and expansive in the way he only became when a crowd was watching him be loved. He was 71 years old, and he had spent the better part of a decade allowing Elliot to manage the family's real estate portfolio. A portfolio that, technically, bore both our names as successor trustees under the revocable family trust our parents had established in 1998. I say technically because, in practice, I had been removed from every conversation about that portfolio for 6 years. The removal had been gradual, quiet, dressed in the language of efficiency and proximity. Elliot lived 40 minutes from our parents. I lived far away. It simply made sense. I had accepted it. For 6 years I had accepted it, and I had watched my father age, and I had told myself the management decisions were sound, and I had believed, with the particular stupidity of someone who trusts without verifying, that the trust document protected us all equally. I gave him the envelope after dinner, after the toast, after my mother cut the cake with the expression of a woman performing happiness for a room that expected it. I had driven 11 hours. I handed it to him in front of everyone because I thought, in some persistent and foolish corner of my mind, that witnesses might matter. The envelope contained 2 items, a birthday card signed by my daughter and me, and a single folded sheet of paper. A preliminary title search on the 3-unit rental property on Chambers Street that my father believed was still held inside the family trust. I had ordered that title search 8 weeks earlier, quietly, from a firm in another city, because something a paralegal said at my cousin's closing 2 months ago had lodged in my mind like a splinter I couldn't reach. My father opened the card first. He smiled at my daughter's handwriting. Then he unfolded the second sheet, and I watched his face, the way you watch a face when you already know what it's going to do. The smile held for exactly 2 seconds after his eyes moved to the top of the document. Then it collapsed into something that had no name I wanted to give it, and he threw the envelope, card, and document together onto the conservatory floor. The paper slid under the leg of a rented chair. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when a family exposes itself in front of people who will remember. He said I was trying to ruin the evening. He said I was jealous of Elliot's relationship with him. He said I had always been difficult, even as a child, and that this, he gestured at the floor, at the document, at me, this was proof. Elliot said nothing. My mother looked at the lilies. My daughter was 12 years old, and she was standing 4 feet away, and she heard every word. I picked the document up off the floor. I smoothed it against my leg. I set it on the table beside my untouched glass of wine, and I looked at my father for a long moment, and I said nothing at all. Because what the title search had told me, what the name listed as sole grantee on that Chambers Street deed, recorded 14 months prior, with my father's notarized signature and no co-trustee acknowledgement, had already changed every calculation I intended to make. Elliot's name was not on that deed. Mine was not either, and the name that was on it belonged to a woman none of us were supposed to know about. Her name was Renata Souza, and she was 53 years old, and she had been a property manager for a commercial leasing firm my father retained in 2014 to oversee 3 of his income-producing assets while his hip recovered from surgery. I know this because after the conservatory, after I buckled my daughter into her seat and drove to the Holiday Inn 12 minutes from my parents' house and sat on the edge of a bed that smelled of industrial detergent, I opened my laptop and I began to do what I should have done 6 years earlier. I did not cry. I had learned, sometime in my 40s, that tears are a form of expenditure, and I had nothing left to spend on shock. The Chambers Street property was not the only one. That was what the next 4 hours taught me, slowly and then all at once. The way these things always reveal themselves when you finally decide to look directly at them. I had access to the county recorder's website, a paid subscription to a title aggregation service I had quietly opened the month before, and 11 years of old trust account statements my mother had mailed to me annually as a formality. Documents I had filed without reading, because I believed the trust was intact and the portfolio was stable, and my father was at his core an honest man. The statements were in a folder in my email. I read them now with the particular attention of someone who had just watched their father throw their gift on the floor in front of their child. The Chambers Street transfer had been recorded on a Tuesday in March, 14 months ago, as a quitclaim deed from the family trust to Renata Souza as an individual grantee. The Delmore Avenue duplex, a property my grandmother had deeded into the trust in 1991, one of the original assets, the one that had anchored the whole structure, had been transferred 8 months before that through a life estate instrument that named Renata Souza as remainderman. 2 properties, 22 months of transfers, both executed with my father's signature as sole trustee, both recorded without co-trustee notification, both absent from the annual statements he had continued to mail my mother. The statements she had continued to forward to me, the statements neither of us had read. I sat with that for a long time. Outside the Holiday Inn window, the January rain came down in sheets against the parking lot asphalt, and the only sound in the room was my daughter's slow breathing from the other bed and the distant signal of a highway I could not see. My father had not acted alone in the mechanical sense. A quitclaim deed requires a notary, a recording fee, a chain of paperwork that does not complete itself. But he had acted without us, without the co-trustee provision in the 1998 trust document that required my signature, and Elliot's for any disposition of trust assets above $50,000, a provision that had been in the document since the attorney drafted it, a provision I had read once and then trusted the way you trust the load-bearing walls of a house you have lived in your whole life without ever inspecting them. Here is what I understood by 2 in the morning. My father had either forgotten that provision existed, or he had believed we would never check. Both possibilities told me the same thing about how he had come to think of us. not as co-trustees with legal standing, but as furniture. Decorative, present at anniversaries, unlikely to pull a title search. I closed the laptop and I lay down beside my daughter in the dark, and I listened to the rain, and I thought about the third document in the folder on my laptop, the one I had not opened yet, the one the paralegal's offhand comment had originally sent me looking for. The amendment, filed 4 months ago with the county probate registry. A trust amendment that, if it said what I suspected it said, would explain not just the transfers but Elliot's silence in that conservatory, his hand on my father's shoulder, the apologetic third inflection in my mother's voice. I did not open it that night. I made that choice deliberately, the way you choose not to read a diagnosis until you are sitting somewhere with walls around you. I needed one more night of not knowing the full shape of it. I needed to be able to drive my daughter to breakfast in the morning and watch her put too much syrup on her pancakes and not let what I knew rearrange her face in front of her. She was 12. She had watched her grandfather throw my gift on the floor. She did not need to know, not yet, that the gift had been a map, and that the map had just shown me how deep the excavation had already gone. I opened the amendment at 6:43 in the morning, in the parking lot, with the engine running, and my daughter still asleep upstairs. It took me 40 seconds to read the operative clause. It took me considerably longer to understand that my brother had signed it as a witness. There is a particular species of betrayal that does not announce itself with noise. It arrives quietly, in the form of a witnessed signature on a notarized document, and it asks nothing of you except that you understand, finally and without any remaining ambiguity, exactly where you stand in the hierarchy of a family you spent decades believing you belonged to. Elliot had not simply failed to tell me. He had sat across a table from an attorney, held a pen, and written his name in the space provided. That is a different category of action entirely. That is a man who made a choice and then drove to our parents' anniversary party and put his hand on our father's shoulder and smiled at me from across a room full of lilies. The amendment had been drafted by a probate attorney in a firm I did not recognize, 40 miles from my parents' house, in a county where our family had no other legal business. That distance was deliberate. I recognized the deliberateness the way you recognize a familiar smell in an unfamiliar room. Not immediately, but with a cold and certain settling. The amendment restructured the successor trustee hierarchy entirely, removing my name from the second position and replacing it with Renata Souza, designated now not merely as a grantee of transferred assets, but as co-trustee with right of survivorship over the remaining portfolio. Elliot retained his position. I had been excised from the document as cleanly as a name removed from a guest list, and the excision had been witnessed by my brother and notarized by a woman whose stamp I would come to know very well in the months that followed. I drove my daughter to breakfast. I watched her put too much syrup on her pancakes. I asked her about the book she was reading, and I listened to her answer. And I kept my face arranged in the expression of a mother who is present, because I was present, and because she had already absorbed enough of that household's atmosphere the night before to last her a long while. On the drive back to Portland, I did not play the radio. I thought instead about the 1998 trust document and the co-trustee provision and the specific language of the amendment. And I thought about what an attorney friend of mine had once said about the difference between a revocable trust and a well-constructed one. He had said it almost as an aside at a dinner party years before any of this was relevant to me. The document protects you only as far as the drafter anticipated someone would eventually misbehave. I had remembered it as a clever observation. I now understood it as a warning I had been given too early to use. By the time we crossed back into Oregon, I had identified 3 things I needed to do in a specific sequence, and I had identified the order not by instinct but by the same logic I had applied for 30 years as a contract compliance officer. You do not move on the largest exposure first, because the largest exposure will alert the counterparty. You secure the perimeter. You document before you act. You act only when the documentation is complete enough that no subsequent denial can alter the record. I had spent my entire professional life watching corporations underestimate that sequence. I was not going to underestimate it now. The first thing I needed was an independent forensic accounting of every asset disposition from the trust in the preceding 3 years. Not a friendly review, not a family accountant who knew my father's name. A forensic firm, retained under a strict confidentiality agreement, instructed to treat the trust documents as they would treat any contested estate, with no presumption of good faith and no courtesy omissions. I retained that firm 11 days after the anniversary party, through an attorney I selected specifically because she practiced in a jurisdiction where my father had no professional relationships and no social ones. Her name was not important then. It would become important later. The second thing I needed was a copy of every bank statement, every wire transfer record, and every rental income deposit associated with the trust portfolio going back to 2019. This required a court order because my father's amendment had been specifically structured, and I do not use that word loosely, to remove my standing as a beneficial co-trustee and thereby limit my access to the financial records as a matter of procedural right. The attorney filed the petition on a Thursday. My father's attorney, a man whose firm had handled our family's legal work for 20 years, and who had apparently not drafted the amendment, called her the following Monday to express what he described as surprise. She told me about that call, with the particular economy of language that good attorneys use when they want you to understand something without advising you to feel it. I understood. The third thing I needed was the one I had been sitting on since Portland, the one I had not yet told even the attorney about, because it was not a legal instrument, and it was not a financial record, and it did not require a petition or a court order or a forensic accountant to locate. It was a clause, one clause embedded in the original 1998 trust document. On page 11, in language so standard, the drafting attorney had likely inserted it from a template, without considering that one day it would become the most expensive sentence my father had ever allowed to remain in a document bearing his signature. I had read that clause 100 times since the parking lot. I had not yet decided when to use it, but I had decided, with the same cold certainty I had used to pick the attorney and the accounting firm and the jurisdiction, that when I did use it, I would use it once and I would use it last, and there would be nothing left to appeal. The forensic accounting took 6 weeks. I know people expect that kind of work to take longer, and it does when the party being investigated has been careful. My father had not been careful. He had been confident, which is the more dangerous condition, because confidence does not bother to cover its tracks. It simply assumes no one will ever think to look. The firm I retained found 11 separate transactions across a 38-month window. 4 wire transfers from the trust's operating account to a personal account, held jointly by my father and Renata Souza, 3 rental income diversions routed through a property management LLC she had incorporated in Nevada 14 months before the Chambers Street deed was recorded, and 4 disbursements coded in the trust ledger as maintenance and capital improvement against properties that, upon physical inspection, showed no evidence of any improvement whatsoever. The Delmore Avenue duplex had a furnace that had not been serviced in 4 years. The total diversion, conservatively calculated, was $312,000. My attorney placed that figure in front of me on a Tuesday afternoon in her office, which smelled of old paper and the particular sharpness of a space that is kept very warm in winter. She set the report on the mahogany desk between us, and she let me read the summary page without speaking, which I appreciated, because there are numbers that require a moment of silence before they become actionable. $312,000, extracted from a trust my grandmother had helped build over 38 months, while my father continued to mail my mother the sanitized annual statements, and my brother continued to attend family dinners, and my daughter continued to grow up believing that the family she came from was, at its foundation, a reasonable one. The number did not make me angry. It made me precise. The court had granted our petition for financial records 6 days earlier, and my father's response to that order had told me something I had not anticipated. He had retained new counsel. The family attorney, the one who had called my lawyer to express surprise, was no longer on the correspondence. In his place was a firm from the city, expensive and aggressive. The kind of firm that sends 4-page letters in response to 2-sentence requests and copies everyone on the distribution list as a form of weather-making. Their first letter arrived the same week as the forensic report, and it accused me of acting in bad faith, of attempting to destabilize a legally valid trust amendment executed by a competent grantor, and of pursuing a personal vendetta against my father, motivated by long-standing familial resentment. I read it twice. Then I gave it to my attorney and told her it could go in the file. What his new counsel did not know, what even my attorney did not know yet, because I had not yet shown her page 11, was that the 1998 trust document contained a no-contest clause with a provision I had never seen, replicated in any other estate document I had encountered in 30 years of contract work. Standard no-contest clauses penalize beneficiaries who challenge a trust by stripping them of their inheritance. This one did something different. This one had been drafted by an attorney who had, apparently, a very specific imagination about family dysfunction. It contained a reciprocal divestment trigger, which provided that any trustee found by a court to have made unauthorized distributions from the trust, corpus, distributions executed without the required co-trustee consent, would be automatically removed as trustee and stripped of any beneficial interest they held under the document, retroactive to the date of the first unauthorized act. Not penalized, not reduced, stripped, retroactively, to the date of the first wire transfer, which the forensic report had identified as a Thursday in October 38 months ago. I had said nothing about this clause to anyone. I had not mentioned it to the forensic accountants, who did not need it to do their work. I had not mentioned it to my attorney, because attorneys, when they know about a weapon, have a professional obligation to deploy it at the tactically correct moment, and I did not yet trust that her sense of timing and mine were aligned. I had sat with it for 11 weeks, through the petition and the financial records order and the 4-page letters from the city firm, and I had let my father's new counsel build their strategy around the assumption that this was a standard trustee misconduct case. Expensive, adversarial, likely to settle in mediation with a negotiated repayment and a revised trust structure. That was the case they were preparing for. That was the case they had priced and staffed and written their aggressive letters about. It was not the case I was bringing. The mediation was scheduled for a Friday 3 weeks out in a neutral office suite downtown. My father would be there, and Elliot and Renata Souza and their collective legal team, and my attorney and me. I had already decided that I would arrive early, that I would be seated before anyone else entered the room, and that I would bring page 11 with me, tabbed and annotated. Inside a folder I intended to open only once. I had also decided something else, something I had not told my attorney and did not intend to tell her until we were in the car on the way to that office. I was not going to mediate. I was going to watch them sit down across from me and explain their settlement position, and I was going to listen to all of it without interrupting, and then I was going to slide a single document across the table, not a demand, not a counteroffer, but a certified copy of the forensic report with the reciprocal divestment clause printed on the cover page as an exhibit header. And then I was going to say, quietly and without any particular emphasis, that I was not there to negotiate a number. I was there to enforce the document my fathers had signed in 1998, which he had apparently forgotten he signed, and which was about to remind him, with the full authority of a probate court, of every word. The mediation suite was on the 14th floor of a building that had floor-to-ceiling windows on the north wall, and the city spread out behind the glass in the particular gray of a February morning that cannot decide whether it intends to snow. I arrived 22 minutes early. I chose the seat at the far end of the table with my back to the window, so that when the others entered, they would be looking into the light, and I would be looking at their faces. That is not a coincidence, I am embarrassed to admit. I had learned, in 30 years of contract compliance work, that the person who controls their own visibility in a room controls a great deal else besides. My attorney arrived 8 minutes after me and set her bag down without comment. She had seen the cover page of my mediation binder that morning in the elevator, and she had looked at me with the expression of a woman recalibrating, which is the closest a good attorney comes to showing surprise. She had asked me one question, whether I was certain. I had told her I had been certain since a parking lot in January, at 6:43 in the morning, with my daughter asleep upstairs. She had nodded and opened her own folder and said nothing further, which confirmed what I had suspected about her from our first meeting, that she was the right person for this particular room. They arrived together, which told me the coordination between them had become habitual. My father entered first, thinner than he had been at the anniversary party, wearing the charcoal suit he reserved for occasions he considered serious, his new attorneys flanking him with the practiced positioning of men who bill by the hour and want you to feel it. Elliot came in behind them, and I watched him locate me at the far end of the table and make the small adjustment people make when a room is not configured the way they expected. Renata Souza sat to my father's left, composed and still, in the way of someone who has been told by their attorney that stillness reads as confidence. She was not wrong. But stillness, I have found, is most useful when the documents on the table support it. The lead attorney from City Firm opened with 12 minutes of framing, the validity of the amendment, the grantor's competence, the absence of any procedural defect in the notarization, the characterization of my petition as an emotionally motivated challenge to a legally sound estate restructuring. I let him finish. I had the particular advantage of someone who has already read the ending, which is that you can afford to be generous with time. When he concluded and looked at me with the expectation of a response or a counterposition, I opened my binder to the tabbed page and I slid 2 documents across the table in a single motion: the certified forensic report and a 1-page summary of the reciprocal divestment clause, with the relevant language highlighted in the precise yellow of something that has been prepared with care. I said, "The trust document your client signed in 1998 contains a reciprocal divestment trigger on page 11. I said, "Your client executed 11 unauthorized distributions across 38 months, documented here, totaling $312,000, each of which required co-trustee consent that was neither sought nor obtained." I said, "Under the operative clause, those acts constitute automatic grounds for trust removal and retroactive divestment of all beneficial interest, including the interest conveyed to Ms. Souza through the quitclaim deed and the life estate instrument, both of which were executed by a trustee whose authority to convey was extinguished at the moment of the first unauthorized transfer." I said all of this in the same tone I used to explain a compliance finding to a board of directors, factual, unhurried, without inflection that could be characterized as hostile. Then I closed the binder and I folded my hands on the table and I waited. The city firm's lead attorney asked for a recess at the 17-minute mark. My father did not look at me during those 17 minutes. He looked at the table, at the documents, once at Elliot with an expression I recognized from childhood, the expression of a man who has made a calculation and discovered the arithmetic was wrong. Elliot looked at his hands. Renata Souza's composure held longer than either of them, which told me something about her that I filed away without immediate use. They did not return from the recess. Their attorney came back alone and told my attorney they wished to discuss a full remediation framework, which is the language people use when they mean they would like to surrender without calling it that. The Chambers Street property was returned to the trust corpus within 60 days. The Delmore Avenue life estate instrument was voided by stipulated court order, and my father was removed as trustee by consent decree, a phrase that contains, if you read it carefully, the entire shape of a man who spent 38 months believing he was invisible and discovered, on a February morning on the 14th floor, that he had never been invisible at all. He had simply been watched by someone who knew how to wait. My daughter turned 13 that spring. I did not tell her the full architecture of what had happened, because 13s is not the age for that conversation. But I did tell her one thing. On an afternoon when she asked me why I had seemed so calm at the anniversary party when her grandfather threw my envelope on the floor, I told her that the envelope had already done its work the moment I handed it to him. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can carry into a room is a question the other person doesn't know you already have the answer to. She thought about that for a moment, in the way she thinks about things that she intends to keep. Then she asked if we could get dinner, and I said yes, and we did, and the case was over, and it had cost my father everything the document had promised it would, which was, from the beginning, exactly the point.